Ladies and gentlemen, today I'd like to speak to you about ancient Alexandria and the birth of modern medicine. From the banks of the Nile to the shores of the Mediterranean, it is in the land of Egypt where medicine probably started. This is the story of a great period in the history of medicine. But let us start at the beginning. Imhotep, who flourished about 5,000 years ago, is the first person whose name is recorded not for being a king or a conqueror, but for the way he contributed to knowledge. He was a statesman. He advised Pharaoh Djoser. He was an engineer. He built the stepped pyramid of Saqqara, precursor to the many great pyramids to come. But above all, he was a physician of great talent who launched the first true medical revolution. That disease was not something to be dealt with by magic, but by science, observation, diagnosis, and treatment. Egyptians would later deify him as the god of medicine. The great tradition of ancient Egyptian medicine was maintained for millennia. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus both speak of exquisite knowledge and understanding. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is the earliest known medical document, written around 1600 years before our Common Era, but it is thought to be based on material from as early as 3000 BCE. It is an ancient textbook on trauma surgery. It mentions even trepanation. It describes anatomical observations and the examination, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis of numerous injuries in exquisite details. It gives the first descriptions of the cranial sutures, the meninges, the external surface of the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid, and the intracranial pulsations. Now, other documents, like the Ebers Papyrus, give details showing an in-depth understanding of how the body works. It defines the heart as the center of the blood supply, with vessels attached for every member of the body. Mental disorders such as depression and dementia are covered, and the descriptions suggest that mental and physical diseases were considered in the same way. The document also had chapters on contraception, diagnosis of pregnancy, and other gynecological matters, intestinal diseases and parasites, eye and skin problems, and the surgical treatment of abscesses and tumors, bone setting and burns were also treated. Dentistry is also covered, and we have evidence of false teeth existing in Egypt some 4,000 years ago. In a number of ways, this ancient Egyptian knowledge was superior to the later Greek knowledge that would flourish in the first millennium before our era. But civilizations wax and wane, and Egypt was in a slow decline, and it was finally conquered by the Persians in 525 BCE, while Greek civilization, already well established from the time of the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, would take over the torch of knowledge and enter a golden period whose achievements continue to dazzle the world to this day. The Greeks erected a philosophical, artistic, and scientific culture that was to rival the best that the world has seen before or since. Medicine would be an important part of this edifice of knowledge, as it was in the age of Pericles, largely through the work of Hippocrates, of course, from 460 BC to around 370 BC, that medicine was recognized as an independent field of science, separate from either magic or the other sciences. It was a profession which women were originally forbidden from practicing. As usually happens with pivotal figures in history, Hippocrates would be a summation of the best of what preceded him, a major contributor himself, and the founder of a school of disciples who followed his teachings. His contributions are many, but he is most famous for the Hippocratic oath still in use in many parts of the Western world. Now, like Imhotep before him, Hippocrates believed that diseases were caused naturally, not because of superstition and gods, arguing that disease was not a punishment inflicted by the gods, but rather the product of environmental factors, diet, and living habits. Indeed, in the entirety of the Hippocratic corpus, there is not a single mention of an alien or a cure due to mystical factors. However, Hippocrates did work with many convictions that were based on what is now known to be incorrect knowledge of anatomy and or physiology, such as his theory of humors. But Rome would soon rule the world, and Roman medicine reaches its apex with Galen, who is in our era from 129 to 216. And there is much more to say about him later. But between the decline of splendid Greece and the rise of mighty Rome, there is a glorious period where in the ancient land of Egypt, Alexander the Great would found a new capital of learning and knowledge on the shores of the Mediterranean, Hellenistic Alexandria. Ah, the glory of Alexandria. To this ancient land of Egypt 2,300 years ago, Alexander the Great, Aristotle's pupil, brought his dream of culture and conquest, of uniting the world and launching a new era. Alexander selected the site for a new capital, Alexandria. His successors in Egypt, the Ptolemies, built Alexandria and made it the intellectual capital of the world. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But a greater legacy was the ancient Library of Alexandria. Launched in 288 BCE by Ptolemy I, Soter, under the guidance of Demetrius of Phaleron, the Museon, or the Temple to the Muses, was part academy, part research center, in addition to the great ancient library. The great thinkers of the age, scientists, mathematicians, poets from all cultures came to study and exchange ideas. Greek was reinforced as the language of science and knowledge in that period. 700,000 scrolls, the equivalent of more than 100,000 modern printed books, filled the shelves. Girls and boys studied regularly at the ancient library, which was open to scholars from all cultures. And at the library, an explosion of science would amaze the world. It was there that Aristarchus was the first person to state that the earth revolves around the sun a full 1800 years before Copernicus. It was there that Eratosthenes proved that the earth was spherical and calculated its circumference with amazing accuracy, 1700 years before Columbus sailed on his epic voyage. Callimachus, the great poet, described the text in the library organized by subject and author, becoming the father of library science. Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry, the basic text studied in schools all over the world, even now. And Herophilus identified the brain as the controlling organ of the body and launched a new era of medicine. And Manetho chronicled the pharaohs and organized Egyptian history into the dynasties we use to this day. They and many others were all members of that amazing community of scholars which mapped the heavens, organized the calendar, established the foundations of science, and pushed the boundaries of our knowledge as they unleashed the human mind on myriad quests. They opened up the cultures of the world, established a true dialogue of civilizations, promoted rationality, tolerance and understanding and organized universal knowledge. For over 6 centuries, the ancient Library of Alexandria epitomized the zenith of learning. To this day, it symbolizes the noblest aspirations of the human mind, global ecumenism, and the greatest achievements of the intellect. Now, the library completely disappeared over 1600 years ago, but it continues to inspire scientists and scholars everywhere. But what about medicine? A famous medical school was established in Old Alexandria during the 3rd century before our era. Although mainly Greek in essence and following the Hippocratic teachings, it was heavily affected by the medical practices of ancient Egypt. Anatomy was particularly advanced due to the possibility of dissecting the human body. The most important Alexandrian physicians were Herophilus and Erasistratus. Many graduates of this medical school traveled and practiced throughout the Mediterranean basin. Galen, the famous Roman physician, studied in Alexandria before practicing in Rome. His teachings and writings survived well into the 16th century and formed the basis of more modern medical practices during the Renaissance. Now, these writings were conserved partly by Christian monks and partly by Arab and Jewish scholars of the Middle Ages. And the medical school of Alexandria was still active until late in the 3rd century of our era. However, it slipped slowly into oblivion after the fire of 391 of our era, which also devastated the last remnants of the ancient library. Unfortunately, almost no work of Alexandrian medicine survived intact. Thus, the production of the Alexandrian doctors is largely lost in the gap between 2 great bodies of ancient medical writings, the Hippocratic corpus of Greece and the writings of the imperial period in Rome, particularly those of Galen. But Alexandria was the bridge between these 2 worlds, and Galen was the last of the great medical specialists to have drunk from the Pierian spring of Alexandria. The best of that school's writings would be incorporated into his work. And it was his work that would represent the summation of the medicine of antiquity. Now, most of the Hellenistic writings were written by historians of medicine. They wrote both medicine textbooks and commentaries on the Hippocratic corpus, which was already lost by the time of Galen, whose voluminous writings and many interests and references remain one of the principal sources for understanding the importance of what was produced in Alexandria in the 4 centuries that preceded him. The earliest figure in the history of Alexandrian medicine were Philetas, of course, who was born in the 4th century before our era, and Paraxagoras, of course, in the 2nd half of the 4th century, who was the teacher of the famous Herophilus, and he was an anatomist. He also provided the study of the diagnostic value of the pulse and the nature of its origin in the blood's vascular system. Now, Aristotle's famous writings on anatomy found particular resonance in Ptolemaic Alexandria, where Herophilus and Erasistratus made extraordinary progress in anatomy and physiology. They were to found 2 important schools of medicine in the heyday of ancient Alexandria. Herophilus was one of the greatest figures in Alexandrian medicine, and who established his own school of medicine, was a pioneer of functional physiology and produced a very large amount of anatomical writings. He correctly identified that it is the brain that is the controlling organ of the body and not the heart, as Aristotle had said. He carried out pioneering work on the anatomy of the brain and the nervous system, and is credited with the identification of the dura mater and the pia mater, two of the brain's membranes, and was tracing the connections between the spinal cord, nerves, and the brain. Herophilus also studied the anatomy of eyes, neural anatomy, and the male and female reproductive system. He also distinguished between veins and arteries. In addition, he did a lot of work in functional physiology and named parts of the human body such as the duodenum. Erasistratus of Lulis, initially a collaborator of Herophilus, argued that the body is composed of a threefold web: elemental nerve, veins, and arteries. And in his account of the heart and its function, he distinguished between the pulmonary and systemic circulation. He said that veins distribute the blood through the body and that air enters the body and then is drawn by the lungs into the heart, where it is transformed into vital spirit and is then pumped by the arteries throughout the body. He also placed great emphasis on the study of the pulse and on the concept of body temperature. Beyond these two giants, Herophilus and Erasistratus, there were many other eminent physicians in Alexandria who, by their collective work, made Alexandria the major center of learning in medicine in the ancient world for about 4 centuries, until precisely around 162 of our era, when Galen went to Rome and flourished there. Now, the school of Alexandrian medicine boasted many luminaries, such as Apollodorus of Alexandria of the 3rd century BCE, a physician whose works on botany, pharmacology, and toxicology were renowned, as well as Callimachus of Bithynia, in the late 3rd century BCE, a physician who belonged to the Herophilian school. Callimachus was also interested in pharmacology and wrote important commentaries on works of the Hippocratic corpus. Other luminaries included Hegetor of the 2nd century BCE, an Alexandrian Herophilian physician who was interested in pulse theory and who treated the dislocation of the thigh bones on the basis of anatomical studies rather than the empirical school's analogies. Chrysermus was another Alexandrian Herophilian physician who developed a theory of pulse that differed from that of Herophilus and Erasistratus. But not all the Alexandrian physicians were disciples of Herophilus or Erasistratus. There was an important empiricist school with such luminaries as Serapion of Alexandria, and who established the empiricist school, or was its second head after Philinus of Kos and Apollonius of Citium. The latter advanced orthopedic surgery, depending on Hippocratic texts on which he wrote many commentaries. Now, Apollonius also wrote substantial critique of fellow empiricist physician and surgeon Heraclides of Tarentum, who, in addition to his commentaries on Hippocrates, wrote 4 books on external and internal therapy, as well as a dietetic treatise and some works in pharmacology. Of the works of Heraclides, approximately 90 fragments and testimonia survive. Sostratus, who probably practiced in Alexandria after 30 BCE, meaning after Cleopatra, was an Alexandrian zoologist and surgeon whose medical practices were chiefly in gynecology. Zopyrus of Alexandria, about the beginning of the 1st century before our era, was another surgeon who invented an antidote for poisons and asked Mithridates, king of Pontus, to allow him to test it on criminals. Just to show that there were many luminaries who promoted Alexandrian science. And even then, Alexandrian science, when much diminished, continued to exist, even as Rome eclipsed it. And among the later physicians of note, we can mention Didymus of Alexandria, who flourished in the 4th or 5th century of our era, who was both a physician and agriculturalist, who is said to have produced an important medical treatise in 8 books and an agricultural treatise in 15 books, the latter being supposed to be one of the sources of the great Byzantine work, Geoponica. But the transition from Alexandria to Rome, which was to be completed by the career of Galen as imperial physician and great writer, was already presaged in the emergence of Pedanius Dioscorides, 40 to 90 in our era, who was a Greek physician, pharmacologist, and botanist who practiced in Rome at the time of Nero and produced the most important pharmacopoeia of all of antiquity. De Materia Medica, a 5-volume encyclopedia about herbal medicine and related medicinal substances that was widely read for more than 1,500 years and which existed in Greek, Latin, and Arabic throughout the Middle Ages, remains the most important reference for our understanding of the medicines used in antiquity and well towards the Middle Ages. But now we come to the pivotal figure of Galen. Claudius Galenus, commonly known as Galen, is the fitting closure of Hellenistic medicine and the start of imperial Roman medicine. He is the most important and the most influential of the ancient Greek physicians, whose enormous mass of surviving treatises have had an extensive influence for more than 14 centuries on the different branches of medical science. Few, if any others, before or after, have had such an impact. He was born around 129 of our common era at Pergamon, into a wealthy family, and studied medicine there. At the age of 20, he traveled to the major medical centers such as Smyrna and Corinth to improve his practical acquaintance with human anatomy, but still in a limited way. In other words, basically only the skeleton. And then he went to Alexandria, where he absorbed all he could from the fading schools of the once splendid metropolis. And at the age of 28, around the year 157, he returned from Alexandria to Pergamon, where he became the surgeon at the School of Gladiators. And in 162, he left for Rome, where he acquired a reputation as a skilled practitioner, physician, lecturer, and writer. He was to leave Rome for a brief period, but returned in 169 at the invitation of the emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wanted his services. And he would be physician to the emperors Marcus Aurelius from 161 to 180, Commodus from 180 to 192, Septimus Severus from 193 to 212. But he did not abandon his research. And over the next 2 decades, he would write and edit his many books. The date and place of his death is uncertain, while some say that he spent his last days at Pergamon. Suidius says that Galen died at the age of 70. Everybody agrees that it is around 200 of the Common Era, although some Arabic biographers propose that he died in Sicily at the age of 88, around 219. But the work of Galen alone forms about half of the mass of surviving ancient Greek medical writings. He wrote no less than 500 treatises, out of which 83 are extant and acknowledged to be genuine, covering not only every aspect of medicine, but also ethics, philosophy, logic, and grammar. And many of Galen's work reached the West during the early Middle Ages, thanks to the Syriac and Arabic translations of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Hubaysh ibn al-Hasan. Now, his principal treatise on anatomical procedures is in 15 books, the last 6 of which, as well as about 2/3 of the 9th, are now existing only in Arabic translation. with the death of Galen, a brilliant chapter of the history of medical science comes to a close. The impetus he provided would carry on in the declining Roman Empire for several centuries. But Rome was waning, and the Dark Ages were setting in. For the best part of the next 1,000 years, it would be the Arabs and Muslims who would carry the torch of science and learning as Europe would remain in the grip of the Dark Ages. And then, with the Renaissance and the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, the torch would pass once more to Europe, and it was in the West that the great journey of medicine would continue. A journey started so long ago by Imhotep, who said that disease was not due to magic, but rather a natural physical process that could be studied and treated. A journey where so much of the creative work in Greece, Alexandria, and Rome would carry humanity forward a long distance and constitute an incredible body of work, parts of which are still of relevance today. And today, 1600 years after the disappearance of the Library of Alexandria in 391 of our era and the murder of Hypatia in 415, the Library of Alexandria was reborn largely on the same spot where it had originally been born some 23 centuries earlier. I am speaking to you from that new library. It was a bold and imaginative idea to recapture the spirit of the ancient library with the tools of the new millennium, a dream that seemed for many to be beyond attainment. But the dream was realized in a few short years. And today, the library stands as a beautiful building that is like a large disk slanting towards the Mediterranean. Now, whether the disk is an echo of the sun disk, so important for ancient Egyptians, or the rising sun of knowledge slanted towards the endless sea with its unbounded horizons, is better left to the imaginations of visitors and viewers. The library is a vast enterprise that relinks with its past in many fields, including medicine, although much more modestly at present than what once was and could be again. The library is a hive of active institutions: planetarium, exploratorium, conference center, 19 museums and permanent art exhibits, 4 art galleries for changing or temporary exhibitions, advanced informatics, 7 specialized libraries, the large library, a supercomputer, 15 research institutes, and including a small research laboratory that connects researchers on the genetics of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is HCM, in Egypt and Europe, under the watchful eye of a modern-day leader of medicine, Sir Magdi Yacoub. But the library does not house a formal school of medicine today, and perhaps it does not need to. Today, great scientists fly in for a seminar and leave. They do not have to reside years after perilous and long journeys in small boats on the Mediterranean. Practitioners organize huge annual conferences to compare notes on their work and discuss the latest technologies and techniques. The new Library of Alexandria, which is host to many such activities in many fields, including a number in the field of medicine, is active in the promotion of knowledge and its dissemination, much as its ancient namesake did. It is on the pages of learned journals and in such meetings as those organized by the new Library of Alexandria that the future, including the future of medicine, is being imagined as it gets crafted in the many cutting-edge laboratories around the world. And like its ancient namesake, the new Library of Alexandria stands for values that we hold dear: rationality, liberty of inquiry, freedom of expression, pluralism, dialogue, learning and understanding. Anchored in the past, active in the present, embracing the future, the modern contemporary library is just beginning its journey of rediscovery, and the best is yet to come. Thank you.